to walk you through a little bit of a history and tutorial of fuzz pedals. We're going to talk about pairings, how to use certain fuzz pedals, and some of the bands that have created some iconic tones using them. I think, fuzz could be a little bit of a misunderstood or a complicated pedal. I think what amp you're playing through matters a lot with it, and this is something that people don't realize when they first get a fuzz pedal. I think this is most notable with the Fuzz Face style circuit. Now, a Fuzz Face, which is the one that most people attribute to Jimi Hendrix using, is a circuit that can sound a little, I wouldn't use the word bad, but it will create a sound that you're not used to if you run it into a really clean amp like a Fender Twin Reverb. That amp has just a lot of a clean headroom to it. And fuzz faces, and actually a lot of fuzz pedals, respond well to an amp that isn't so clean and naked. So Hendrix, for instance, when he was using the fuzz face circuit, was running into Marshalls, and the Marshalls were cranked. So those Marshalls, even though they were loud, they break up once they start hitting 4 or 5, so he wasn't really running that into a clean amp. There's a little bit of a chemical reaction that has to happen between the fuzz pedal and the amplifier, right? And particularly with the fuzz face circuit, that means that it works best with an amp that it doesn't necessarily have to be being hit really hard, it doesn't have to be saturated and super distorted, but just breaking up a little bit will help pair with that fuzz face circuit. There's also another interesting thing about the fuzz face circuit that varies itself from some of the other fuzz circuits, and that is it's the most responsive to volume changes. There's a lot of times when Hendrix was using a fuzz face and you didn't realize it because the sound wasn't fuzzy, but a fuzz face with the volume turned down about halfway will yield a really nice, clean, but slightly compressed and interestingly EQ'd tone. This is a real go-to for a clean sound for myself, actually, and many others have used this trick over the years, but I think it's not as well known a tip as it could be. I'm going to run through some examples. I'm going to play through a fuzz face circuit. Now, there's two different types of fuzz face circuits. There's a germanium style, and then there's a silicon style. Now, the style that Hendrix was most notably using was the germanium circuit. That just it has a little bit more of a greenier, wild sound to it, where the silicone is a little bit more predictable and doesn't respond to temperature changes. It's more stable, but what comes with that is a little bit more of a compressed and what I think is a little more of a fizzy of a tone. But that doesn't mean it's bad. David Gilmour used the silicon based fuzz face on Dark Side of the Moon, so we could hear sort of two polar opposites of fuzz faces, the Electric Ladyland or Are You Experienced era of Jimi Hendrix, or the Dark Side of the Moon era of David Gilmour. So they're both very usable, but they sound a little different. I'm using a germanium-based one. It's from Analog Man. It's called the Sunface. There's a lot of fuzz face style circuits out there these days. I think some from Dunlop and various other builders. What you have to keep in mind is what transistors they're using. Some companies, and I'm just going to mention this about all the fuzz pedals, some companies are a little vague and even misleading about what transistors they're using. Analog Man is really great because he's completely transparent with what he's using. He sources out new old stock transistors and hand picks them and tests them, and his fuzz face style pedals, or any of his fuzz pedals, honestly are super legit because he's really taken the extra time to make sure that he's recreating them as close to possible, almost like getting in a time machine and going back to the late 60s and having one built in that era. But again, don't just believe a pedal maker that says new old stock parts on it. There's a few that aren't actually using new old stock parts at all. So just look into it a little bit. They don't sound the same. That's why I'm mentioning that. Let's check out the Sunface pedal. amp clean. So I'm using a little more output from the fuzz pedal. This is a trick I also do a lot, is I make sure that I'm at unity gain or just a little above unity gain. I find that all gain pedals sound a little different if you don't run them hot enough. They'll sound small and compressed. Sometimes people will kick on an overdrive fuzz pedal or a distortion pedal and their sound will get smaller actually. This is because they're below unity gain. So make sure, you can even get a decibel meter, that when you're kicking on your fuzz pedal that you're just a little above. You're hitting the preamp tubes and the amp just a little harder than clean. With a neck pickup. Let me show you an example of how the Fuzz Face likes to clean up. Let's check out the Fuzz Face tone as it cleans up. This is full volume. You roll it back about halfway. I have my guitar on about 6 there. So you can hear we lost a lot of saturation, but what really happens is it cleans up in a nice clean way that's slightly compressed and just takes away some of the, I don't know, just the transients and the biting high end that we might have from a clean guitar signal. Now this works well not just on Vox amps, which is what I'm using. I'm using an AC15 right now. This works well with Marshalls and a whole plethora of Fender Tweeds and Black Faces. I'd say, again, back to the earlier conversation, it just tends to be the higher wattage Fender Blackface and Silverface amps that are an issue with fuzz circuits, and in particular the Fuzz Faces. But it works well with Blackface Princetons and Deluxes and even Supers, and the same thing with those series of Silverface amps. Let's talk about the Tone Bender family of fuzz pedals. Now, the Tone Bender is one of the earliest versions of fuzz pedals. It only is predated by the Maestro Fuzz Tone, which is what you hear on Satisfaction from the Beatles. And it predates the Fuzz Face as well. In fact, the Fuzz Face is based off the Tone Bender MK 1.5. The MK1, or Mark I as it's referred to, is most notably used by Mick Ronson from David Bowie. So on all those classic Bowie records that Mick Ronson played on, which is Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory and Lead and Zane, so those records, he, not all the time, but often used the gold MK1 fuzz pedal. Now, it's quite a unique circuit. It's brassy and just wild and can kind of be gated and uncontrollable, and it's just really forward and unapologetic about its sound. It tends to be a little less compressed than some of the later versions of the Tone Bender, and you could hear it also like on Taxman from the Beatles, and I think it's on Think For Yourself as well. The Beatles were definitely using one of the MK1s on some of the mid to later Beatles stuff. It's one of my favorite fuzz pedals just because it allows, I think, a little bit more of the transient to come through, so it doesn't feel as compressed or I don't know, soft as some other fuzz pedals do, but they are a little bit of a particular pedal. They only were made with germanium circuits, and actually real tone benders were only made for about a year. They're very difficult pedals to make, so I think they eventually figured out a way to streamline production so that they can put out a more consistent product and save money on labor. Right now I'm using a tone bender MK1 that's made from LIC pedals here in New York City. He is a pedal maker that is very particular about what transistors and components that he uses. He uses a lot of new old stock parts and is completely transparent in what parts go in this pedal. You can see pictures of them, you can look up the parts, and you can authenticate it. It's the real deal. Let's listen to the LIC Mark I through this Les Paul. We roll back the volume knob a little bit. Tone bender circuit doesn't clean up the same way that the Fuzz Face circuit does. When you roll the volume back, instead of getting that really clean, sort of compressed sound, it gets more gated and the fuzz will start to chop off, which I think is actually fun, and a lot of people that are really into the MK1 circuit really dig this, so check it out. You can just hear the sustain of the note. It gets messed with a little bit. It starts kind of getting chopped off. It gets truncated a little bit, which can just be fun when you're soloing. Do a little bit of playing on the neck pickup using a tone bender circuit. One thing I really like about the tone bender circuit is, and particularly the LIC version of it, has a little more gain than the original Mark I's, but there's something about bending and the way it grabs the note. It just really latches onto it and gives you a really wonderful amount of sustain, and the unpredictable gating I find fun sometimes. We're now going to discuss the Big Muff family of fuzz pedals. Now, these are silicone-based pedals, and they sound radically different than other fuzz pedals, particularly the Maestro, satisfaction tone as I mentioned, or the tone benders, or the fuzz faces. They have their own thing. Like I mentioned, the silicone thing really changes the way they respond and they sound. The volume rollback effect, which happens on the fuzz face and the tone bender, isn't the same on the Big Muff. It really just doesn't sound super flattering as you roll your guitar volume back. But full the way up, it's almost part fuzz, almost part distortion. Now, it actually is a fuzz pedal, but it's the first pedal that really starts to venture into those distortion tones. Now, the Big Muff was used heavily through grunge music. David Gilmour switched to the Big Muff. It's all over the Wall album. He pairs it with another pedal, which I'll talk about later. But also bands like the Smashing Pumpkins have used them. Jay Massey's has used the Big Muffs all throughout his career. So it plays a very big part in rock music. I'm gonna plug in my Stratocaster and we're gonna listen to a little bit of tone. So I'm gonna be using the JHS Muffuletta, which is a pedal that JHS developed that basically has all the circuits from the important eras of the Big Muff in them. The Big Muff isn't as wild of a distortion as the Fuzz Face or the tone bender is, where you get some surprises out of the tone bender. Sometimes it gates notes, sometimes it lets notes bloom. The Big Muff doesn't really do that. For the last category, I want to talk about some modern pedal builders that are doing less than ordinary things with their fuzz pedal builds. And the first one is the ZVEX Fuzz Factory, which has become a classic by now. It's based on a germanium fuzz face circuit, but don't let that fool you into thinking it sounds like a fuzz face. It really doesn't, and it really can get a lot weirder, do weird gated effects, have overtones. You can almost make it sing like a theremin because it'll just oscillate on its own. So it can actually be a bit of a tricky pedal to use in certain situations, but dialed in correctly, it sounds like no other pedal does. And I have it set up right now so it does sort of a gating thing. If I roll my volume back a little. just hear it. Not only is it gating, but it sounds like it's dying a little bit. So I literally have it just almost one click back. It does some weird stuff, and it's also intentionally sounding broken, which work really well in some things. Obviously, if you're doing some straight up classic rock music, it's going to sound a little out of place, but for a lot of people that are experimenting with their tones, it could really be a very creative pedal to use. I have it set right now to oscillate, so you're going to hear it squealing. Almost like a theremin, but if I leave it up and I play along with it, here I'm getting a little bit more of a traditional fuzz sound from it. I have it set up now to be a little more like a traditional fuzz. One last fuzz pedal I want to show you is the Death by Audio Evil Filter. Now, the Evil Filter is comprised of a filter and the Evil Fuzz. Combined in one pedal, you can turn each one of those circuits on or off. I'm not going to focus on the filter aspect of it right now. I'm just going to use the Evil Fuzz, which is a really interesting fuzz circuit because on one of the settings, what it does is it actually blooms the note after I hit it. So you hit the note and all of a sudden it'll just kind of swell. And I really like this. Let's just listen to a little bit. find I can really get out with this pedal because it just, it's very friendly to making noise. I find myself reaching for and playing notes that I wouldn't normally play. It handles chords and single notes really well. It doesn't seem to bloom as much when I play the chords, but when I play single notes, it's just all hell kind of breaks loose sometimes, which can be really exciting. And I think like when you're trying to figure out your fuzz tones, you gotta kind of start with an era and figure out what you're looking to get out of a fuzz pedal. As you saw from these examples, sure, they're all fuzz pedals, but they all not only react differently, but they have very different characteristics and personalities to them. And say having a fuzz face isn't going to cover everything for you, especially if you're into some of the more modern noisescape stuff. That's where, let's say, having like a Fuzz Factory or an Evil Fuzz or something of that nature could suit your needs better. But I think to have them up into, I think to have an idea of there being a couple different categories is really important. You need to figure you have your tone bender, your fuzz face, you have your Big Muff, and then you have some of your more modern sort of off the beaten path fuzzes. And from there you can start to narrow it down a little bit more. Do you want silicone? Do you want germanium? None of the fuzzes I showed you today will break the bank. They're not necessarily cheap or under $100. However, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to own every pedal. I'm just trying to show you all these so you can get an idea of what the tonal palette is for fuzz pedals, because I think if you haven't really played through a bunch of them, they can seem like they're all essentially the same thing, right? Fuzz is a fuzz, but it's really not. And I hope that I gave you a little bit of a view into the world of fuzz and some of the varieties that we have. At least the varieties I gave you are enough to get you jump started and hopefully headed down the right path to find your tones that you admire and long for. I think it's important to look at your favorite players and try to hunt down similar fuzzes that they were using if you're really into those sounds, right? I mean, if Hendrix is your guy, then obviously you should be looking at fuzz faces, or if Billy Corgan is your guy, you should be really looking at Big Muffs, particularly the ones with the op amp. But we'll save that for another time, as you'll find out that even within the Big Muff world there are several variations. But at least today I hope to have give you a little bit of a compass and send you in a direction so that when you're getting into fuzz, you have a little bit of an idea of where to head. Just keep in mind that the pairing with the amp is important and the volume to which you run the pedals never below unity gain. Until next time, have fun.